Welcome to the JareSquare Podcast, a devotional podcast for 21st century Christian. Today we're going to be discussing the Kingdom of Heaven. So here's the question I want to pose. What does the book of Matthew say about God's kingdom, and why does it matter? So here's some of the context behind the book of Matthew. Most people think that Matthew was written around 80 or 90 AD. And believe it or not, the book of Matthew is actually anonymous, but early church tradition attributes the book of Matthew to the disciple of Jesus. The kingdom of God is referenced throughout the Gospels, but Matthew is the gospel that instead states the kingdom of heaven. In it, he says kingdom of heaven 32 different times. As far as we're concerned, there are three different themes that we're going to be tackling in this podcast concerning the book of Matthew and the kingdom of heaven. And the first is going to be the breakthrough of God's kingdom, the reign of God, and reverence for God. As far as today goes, we're going to be focusing on reverence for God. Traditionally, Jewish practitioners would substitute words for the name of God. For example, instead of saying Yahweh, the Lord's name, they would say the Lord, or Adonai in Hebrew. Ancient Hebrews would never ever say Yahweh. It was close to, in their minds, a sin to say the word Yahweh, or the name Yahweh. And that may sound unusual, except for when you think about our cultural context, a lot of times we do this too. For instance, if you're surprised by something, you might say, oh my gosh. Or for the older people out there listening, I know people used to say Jesus Crow instead of Jesus Christ if they were upset about something. So a lot of people believe that the book of Matthew he was trying to be reverent for the gospel. He was trying to be reverent towards the name of God. So instead of saying the kingdom of God, he'd say the kingdom of heaven and insert heaven instead of God. In the book of Matthew, there are some examples that you see Matthew pointing to the reverence that Jesus had for the Father. Matthew 21:13-14 says, "And Jesus entered the temple and drove out all those who were buying and selling in the temple, and overturned the tables of the money changers and seats of those who were selling doves. And he said to them, 'It is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers.'" So the question is, how do we, as Christians, as believers, as fellow people in communion with the Spirit of who God is, how do we treat God with reverence? Most of us don't treat God like an immanent being that is constantly around us and infinitely more powerful than we are. So the question is, are we treating our lives like God's temple? Or are we treating it the same way the merchants did, the same way that the money changers did, and focusing on these tertiary and secondary things that aren't really critical to our faith, to our passionate pursuit of the Lord? Because everything matters. What we look at, what we think about, what we focus our energy on, all of it matters. It all matters. Even the things that we look at with our eyes is something that matters. It's the way that we perceive the world around us is a way that we give or take away reverence from God. What we look at, what we think about, what we focus our energy on, all of those can be things that add or detract from our focus and our reverence for the Lord. My energy is a hard one for me. I constantly find myself wanting to focus my energies on useless or self-motivating things. How can I be successful at this thing that ultimately doesn't bring any value to the kingdom of heaven? So today, as you go about your day, my challenge to you is focus on how you can be living your life in reverence of the Lord. How can you be setting yourself apart in a way that isn't as a money changer, that isn't as a thief in the house of God? The world is his footstool. We need to be stewards of the call that God has put on our life to be his people in a dark, dark place. As you go through today, think about that and focus on how you can be God's spokespeople and how you can treat him with reverence.